I'm Colin Ayres, the current chair of OzCon International, and I'm joined today by my good friend and original host of the Winkie Con, OzCon's original name, Peter Hanff. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Colin. It's good to see you again, and also to say hello to everybody who may be watching this show. We are both holding up books that basically create a framework around what we're going to talk about today, covering a span of more than 20 years in our case, but at any event, I start with the seminal book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This is the book that you will see shortly in the slides in black and white from 1964, but the book has remained in my collection in tolerably good shape for a long time, and many people haven't actually seen this book, so I wanted to at least give them a glimpse of it. It's one of the most magnificent children's books published in the United States. It was a record-breaking production in 1900 that was lavishly illustrated and printed. And it became the beginning of a long series of Oz books that went from 1900 through 1963. And people are still adding newer books, but they're not part of the original series. So I'm going to go ahead and put this book down, and I'm going to switch over so that you can see a virtual background behind me, and we'll continue this in a moment. All right. I was born in Florida in 1944, which gives you a sense of my age. My father had loved Oz books when he was young and had quite a number of them. Most of his he left at his parents' house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his mother gave them to the Salvation Army at some point. But the few that he had when we were in Florida, he began reading to me when I was 3, and I got hooked immediately. And I was 5 when the re-release of the MGM Wizard of Oz movie came out in 1949. He took me to see that, and I was just enthralled with that as well. So Oz has really been part of me from the beginning of my conscious memory. Go ahead.
So, and you currently, you reside in California?
Right. When I was 12, we moved to Los Angeles, to the San Fernando Valley, which is in the north part of the city. And I had stopped reading Oz books. I only had a few. They were my dad's originally. I was reading other kinds of things like Tarzan of the Apes and John Carter of Mars and things of that sort. I had also discovered the Nancy Drew books by that time and the Hardy Boys. But junior high school chums in the San Fernando Valley discovered the Oz books, and they had loved Oz books when they were in elementary school. So they began borrowing them and reading them avidly. And the 4 of us decided to start a book collecting club. Los Angeles was a much, much larger city than Miami had been. And it also had dozens of bookstores. In the UK, we call them secondhand bookstores. In the United States, we usually call them used bookstores. And to me, they were just like treasure houses. So the 4 of us got permission from our parents to do this club on Saturdays, and we would take a public bus 25 to 30 miles each Saturday to either go to downtown Los Angeles to the bookstores there or to Hollywood, where there were a lot of bookstores as well. And we were collecting in unison and in competition. So I had started collecting, I guess you could say, when I was a little child, but I really began in earnest when I was in junior high school.
Great. It's been very similar for me. Well, similar in terms of my first interest in Oz from very early, from 3 to 5. People will probably gather that I'm not from California or the USA. I'm actually from Staffordshire, England. But I came to Oz through the movie when I was 3 or 4 years old, and it was my Frozen. I would watch it 3 or 4 times a day, to the point that my poor mother could not watch the movie anymore, and in fact tried to stop me from having to rewatch it again and again by accidentally recording over it. And then, yeah, it never quite, not from the point she didn't want me collecting. She was driven mad by listening to Yellow Brick Road and the movie over and over again. She tried to kind of, having reasons as to why I couldn't watch it. Fortunately, though, for me, that made no difference. And then I really got into the books from the 90s, really. So I'm 41 years of age. And I really got into the books when I was about 10, and that was a result of seeing the movie and Return to Oz and the Sin-Art series of Oz, which then led me into seeing the book credits to go, okay, let's go to the library and find out about all these different books. And it just snowballed from there to actually coming to the convention, which I think we can talk about maybe how I got to the convention and chairing the convention a bit later. Maybe we would start the slideshow and start reminiscing about your start, because you were essentially the first chair actually involved in creating the convention from the beginning, the original Winkie Con way back in 1954.
It was 1964, and what happened that year was I was an undergraduate at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and they announced for the first ever book collection contest. And I had a significant collection by that point. At least I thought it was significant. So I entered the collection contest with trepidation, because I was basically revealing to the world at large that I, a young adult, collected children's books. And I knew my parents were very uncomfortable with my collecting children's books, but I won first prize. And so at the celebration of the awards, the rare book librarian met me at the lobby of the library and said, there's a surprise for you on the terrace. It was my parents. They had yanked my 3 siblings out of school and had driven from the San Fernando Valley to be with me for the celebration. And that was pivotal and a changing event in my life, because now they could see there was some virtue in what I was doing rather than some embarrassment. And it also led to a call from an antiquarian bookseller in Santa Barbara named Max Richter, who in the 1920s had started a bookstore in Oakland, which is right near Berkeley, where I live now, called The Book Den. But he moved it to Santa Barbara in the 20s, and he reserved all of the Oz-related material for one other Santa Barbara person, and that was Riva Milne. And we'll hear of Riva and see her in a short while. But she was a major collector of really important children's books. She had Edmund Dulac, she had Arthur Rackham. She had a major collection, and she did it early enough so she was able to build nicely. But Max Richter helped her because he wouldn't sell Oz things to me or to our other competitor, Professor Warren Hollister, who was a professor of medieval history at Santa Barbara. So with the collection behind me and the call from Max Richter offering me a W.W. Denslow collection, I ventured forth. I suddenly had some collecting money. And the poster you see behind me is a reproduction from the original that I bought from Max Richter. This is an 11-inch by 17-inch panoramic poster from 1900, promoting not only The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but if you look in the upper right corner, you see Father Goose, which was the best-selling children's book of 1899, another book published by Denslow and Baum. So that's sort of the background, and Warren and I began talking about the possibility of doing a West Coast Oz meeting. The International Wizard of Oz Club had a convention every year in the Midwest, in Indiana, by a lake called Bass Lake in Knox, Indiana, which was run by L. Frank Baum's third son, and his wife, who was a vivacious, gregarious, operatic woman. And they had a small summer lodge, and they opened it up to the Oz Club people, I think in 1961. And Warren had attended at least one of those conventions, and he knew that was a lovely thing, but we were just starting off. So the idea of being able to put on a weekend-long convention didn't seem realistic to us. So we worked with Judy Pike, who was a housewife in San Bernardino, and ultimately with Blake Maxim, who was like me, a student at a university in the San Fernando Valley. And the 4 of us pulled ourselves together to host one convention rather than 2 competing conventions, which was what Fred Meyer, the secretary of the Oz Club, was afraid we were going to do. And so that moved us toward the long tradition of the Winkie Convention. And I took advantage of my parents. They had been embarrassed by me, so I said, let me take advantage of this. We will do the first convention at our family house. We will completely remove all furniture from the living room and put in tables, and we will have a major exhibition of all the published writings of L. Frank Baum, which Warren and I could support primarily out of our collections with a few extreme rarities, which he then borrowed from Edna Baum, who was a daughter-in-law of the author of The Wizard of Oz, who lived in Claremont, California, some 40 miles east of us.
So how did your parents take to you running the first convention?
I think they quite enjoyed it. I think the turnout was unknown. People had to register and arrive. I don't know how many people, I may actually figure this out. I have a recollection that the number was either 40 or 60 people, but I think I actually have a guest book from that convention. And so I was meeting a lot of people for the first time. Dick Martin flew out from Chicago, and I'd been corresponding with him as an undergraduate. Fred Meyer.
So Dick Martin, for those that don't know, is?
Dick Martin was a major collector, probably the most significant collector of L. Frank Baum rarities. And he basically used much of his inheritance money to buy up things. Now, in those days, admittedly, prices were unlike prices of the modern time, but he was actually spending premium money. And he was a Chicago native, loved that city in a way that I've never met another Chicagoan who did. Whenever I was there, he was my host, and he was helping me explore his city. But he came out to the meeting, and he had just published a new book called The Magic Map by Marion Beckler. And so that was newly published. He had also brought out 4 illustrated thin books that were Oz book, shortened Oz books. And those he had done the illustrations for. And in 1963, he illustrated what became the very last of the original Oz series, Merry-Go-Round in Oz. So those books were available. Dick was there, and we set him up on the veranda at the front of the house so that he could sign books for people. And Fred Meyer came out by train. In those days, he only traveled by train. So he was able to be with us. And then other people whom I didn't know arrived. I met Edna Baum, who was married into the Baum family in 1914. So this is 50 years after that. I met Elizabeth Ligonbaum, who was the widow of Frank J. Baum, Baum's eldest son, and she came in with Edna. I threw together slides because I've been taking pictures of Oz meetings from the very beginning. I haven't attended every meeting because I sometimes didn't live in California during those years, but I've attended most of them. So let's just start. Let's start with books, because from my perspective, the whole thing was all about book collecting and books. And I mentioned Max Richter. This is me in '64. That's the black and white picture of the very book I showed at the beginning. On the wall are framed color plates, all 24 of them in the first printing, that were never bound into a book. They have larger margins because they didn't need to be trimmed. But one of the things that I noticed from the very beginning is that the West Coast Oz meetings were really much more family-oriented than was true of the original conventions in the Midwest. Not to say that there weren't children at those meetings, but those were really meetings primarily of adults. And for some reason on the West Coast, we were family-oriented. So I'm just going to throw in some examples of long friendships. This is Stephen Kuntz as a small boy.
And I met him as an adult as well.
And you know him as an adult. This is Stephen Kuntz, completely worn out by the excitement of Oz. But he and I have been buddies for a really long time. I think you can tell that from the picture. And now this is Stephen, as we know him today, with his own son, who's just a little younger than Stephen was when I first encountered him. I'm now taking us back to the San Fernando Valley, and that is Dick Martin with me sitting to his right. He is signing one of the books, probably Visitors from Oz, which he illustrated. And the Marion Beckler book, The Magic Map of Oz, is showing, I wonder if my arrow shows. I'll show my arrow. Probably I could do it better, but if you can see that, that's her book that he had just illustrated. But this was our living room. And all the furniture in the living room and all the things on the wall were removed, except for a couple of lamps. And we put in tables, and in order to protect the first editions, we simply covered them with clear plastic drop cloths. With one exception, I did borrow or rent an exhibition case, a jeweler's case, so that we could put Mrs. Baum's items, which were unique and extremely valuable, behind glass. I don't have a picture of that, but that was something I did. And it was an interesting transaction because the used furniture dealer would not rent it to me. He would only sell it to me. And then if I didn't break it, he would buy it back for me for $10 less than I paid. So that was renting it. But that's what he did. This was Fred Meyer, who traveled out by train. In the background is Al Vogt, who was a major collector of boys' series books. This is in our family room, as we called it, a large room in the center where we put lots of chairs for the program that was going to be indoors. The house was centrally air conditioned, and the San Fernando Valley in August runs to be about 100 degrees outside, so the air conditioning was crucial, and it was still too warm because there were too many people. But Fred is admiring my father's interest in aeronautics and astronomy. There was a great big picture of the moon. But if you look in the display case, you see another longtime member of the Oz Club, Richard Paul Smyers, who is known by some as Camera Chest, because he always had a camera. I'm afraid that reputation now applies to me. But you will also see that there were little artifacts and rarities on the shelves that represented contributions by those attending. Blake Maxim, the other student who helped coordinate the meeting, was and is a stage magician. So he dressed himself as the Wizard of Oz and did a full magic show at the edge of the family room. You can see the exhibition room behind him, which is the living room. Then my mother had created a decorated cake because we realized that we were doing this meeting, I think it was August 21st of 1964, right around the date of Ozma of Oz's birthday that we learned about by putting together factoids in The Road to Oz of 1909. But Elizabeth Baum and Edna Baum were there, and they are standing before the small pantry about to cut the cake, which is decorated as a map of Oz. And you will notice that the Winkie country of Oz is on the left side of the map, because we know that the Winkie country is the western country of Oz. The maps from 1914, for some reason, reversed the position of Winkies and Munchkins. So a lot of published maps reversed the blue on the right and the yellow on the left. But this is an authentic map of Oz. In the garden, we had an exhibition of books that were available for sale and trading. Reva Milne, whom I mentioned earlier, is the woman in the center of the picture. Blake Maxim is in the upper right corner, grinning at the camera. And right behind him, although you don't see her at this moment, is Judy Pike, the other coordinator of the program. The man standing in the right of the picture is Manuel Weltman, who was an unusual entrepreneur in Los Angeles, who discovered unusual and rare Baum contributions to a Los Angeles social club, the Uplifters of Los Angeles. Manny was bumptious, somewhat rude, and in your face. And I think he was just explaining to a very skeptical audience that he had found L. Frank Baum pornography, which he had suppressed. We don't believe that that was what it was. We think what it was plays that he did for the Gentlemen's Club, the Uplifters, that were somewhat risque by 1914 standards. Warren Hollister with the pipe is standing facing Blake Maxim, and Charlie Hollister, Warren's eldest son, is talking to Blake as well about the fine points of a first edition of The Road to Oz. So Charlie was being brought up in the club.
Having met many of the current generation Hollisters, I can see the family resemblance.
Generation beyond them. That's true.
Yeah.
So you've got Blake on the left. You have got Elizabeth Patrick, P-A-T-T-R-I-C-K, who was the mother of one of the pioneer researchers on Oz, who wrote something called Unexplored Territory in Oz, 3 essays published by the OzCon. He was a corresponding friend of Fred Meyer, and unfortunately he died very young, about a year before the meeting at the age of 30. Edna is looking over things. And then Fred Patton is another one of the LA science fiction fantasy celebrities. He attended the first several meetings, but as he explains in the 50th anniversary book that David Maxine pulled together for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Winkie Convention, Fred was really more interested in discussing fantasy and science fiction and the content and the theories behind the books. And he didn't find that the Oz crowd that he was encountering approached Oz that way, so he didn't continue. We held the second of the Oz meetings at Edna Baum's house in Claremont, California in 1965. This is the front of her house. This is Edna in the center with the flowered dress. Her grandchildren, Florence Hurst, her daughter, who was known as Baumy when she was in school, B-A-U-M-Y, but it sounded like she was crazy, is the woman in green. And Stan Baum, Edna's younger son, is on the right with one of his daughters. And then this is another picture. My sister is on the left of the picture. We're at Edna's house, not on the weekend of the convention, but another weekend at the same time. And I'm holding Edna's Siamese cat, Snoopy. And Florence is there in the yellow. One of Florence's daughters is there. I think she was Susan. And Barbie Winters is there. She was another granddaughter or great-granddaughter of L. Frank Baum through marriage. Her grandmother was Brenda Baum, who had married Harry Neal Baum, Baum's third son. In the great family room of Edna's house, we have a portrait of Judy Pike chatting with Dick Martin. Fred was not able to come to that convention. But the guest of honor for the meeting was Matilda Jewel Gage of Aberdeen, South Dakota. And because Edna's first encounter with the Baums was about 1899, 1900 in Castle Park area of Michigan, Macatawa Park, Michigan, which is a suburb of Holland, Michigan, on Lake Michigan, a summer resort. She knew the Baums primarily through Father Goose, his book, which we've talked about, and which we see in the image behind my head. So the decorated cake, this is the second of the Oz decorated cakes, is actually celebrating Father Goose. Upstairs in the guest room, adjacent to my guest room, was Matilda Gage, and she was visited by people who lived in the next village over from me in the San Fernando Valley, the Rushes, R-O-E-S-C-H''S. So I knew the Rushes, who were from Aberdeen, South Dakota. He was a retired banker and they retired to Los Angeles, but they were close friends of Matilda's. And it turns out their daughter is Sally Rush Wagner, one of the major American feminist historians who created the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation in Syracuse, New York, years later. So we are a family with lots of intertwining connections. Then, also at the 1965 meeting, we have Phyllis Baum, who was the daughter-in-law of Edna, married to Robert Stanton Baum, Edna's son. And I'm sorry, I think his name is Robert Allison Baum. Robert Stanton was his father, Edna's husband. And Bob Baum and his wife Claire, who are now married, they were just boyfriend and girlfriend at the time, also attended that meeting. And Bob has a major collection of research value for Baum and Oz, and they live in the San Fernando Valley. So they continue to have a connection with us all these years later. And one of the peculiar features of Edna's large house was that it had a Pioneer hydraulic Otis elevator that was hydraulically powered. So you pulled the cable that my best friend Steve Fish has his hands on, you would pull it down and that would cause water to flow into the tube and pump the thing up to the second floor. I was fascinated by that machine, and then I lived on the ground floor, so she didn't use it. So whenever I would visit, which was frequently until I moved to Washington, D.C., she would have me running up and down a little bit because it would get very stiff because grungy. So it was just sort of a feature of the house that was fun. We then moved over to Florence Hurst's house the next summer, and then for the fourth meeting, we met in the San Fernando Valley in an unair-conditioned meeting hall in Van Nuys, Sherman Oaks, a war memorial place. It was absolutely hideous, and I think maybe only 20 people showed up because no one was willing to go to an unair-conditioned part of the San Fernando Valley. So the very next year, we moved the convention to Santa Barbara, to the house of Warren and Edith Hollister, who live right at the very edge of settlement with a canyon dropping away and the Santa Barbara mountains behind them, with a large swimming pool. So the air in Santa Barbara is tempered by cool air from the ocean. But that was the first time we actually did a formal costume contest. And people went all out for that. And in the center of the picture, you see Ojo of Oz, and that is Kevin Harris in a very elaborate costume. We did a costume parade and competition around the swimming pool. Another founder of the Oz Club is Ruth Berman as Princess Isaposo, the woman in white at the far left of the picture. And then I left. I was already in Washington, D.C. by 1968, living there for 3 or 4 years. And then I came back to California at the end of 1970. And in 1971, Fred Otto proposed that we try doing a weekend convention. And he found a place in coastal Santa Barbara near San Luis Obispo, coastal California, near San Luis Obispo, called the Cambria Pines Lodge. And we met there for 4 years, and the company went bankrupt. We then had to find a new place. And I happened to be a fan of Yosemite National Park. So I checked and was able, through wheeling and dealing, to get us rooms at the Hotel Wawona, which is at the very south edge of Yosemite National Park. It's actually a hostelry that was not always in the park. It was founded in the 1870s, and it's really quite a lovely place, but it is extremely old-fashioned. It's wood frame buildings, it's from the Victorian era, and has some of that decor. We had a meeting room that was big enough for a while to accommodate us, and as I have said from the beginning, the early group was pretty much focused on collecting books and artifacts related to the publishing history of the Oz books. So we used the Sun Parlor, which was the only really open meeting space available to us, to do our program and our auction. In the picture here, right in the foreground, you can hardly see him because of the blur, is Rob Roy McVeigh from Seattle. He was then only known as Rob McVeigh. And Jim Hanff, who created the Oz Club's famous maps, is the fellow on the left with the glasses. That was his only visit to a West Coast Oz meeting. But everybody is looking at what is being offered. And I know from a recollection of David that I donated a first edition of The Wizard of Oz, which sold at that auction for $50, and then it was put back into the auction a few years later, and David bought it for $75. So it was a bargain.
Mm-hmm. I would love to get a first edition Wonderful Wizard for that price.
No?
I would love to get a Wonderful Wizard of Oz first edition for that price.
Yeah, that's, I don't, he may have other ones now, but that was where that's the first one he got. We continued the tradition of the costumes at Wawona, and people tolerated it. It was obviously a big family gathering as far as everybody else was concerned. The rules of the Yosemite were strict. We could not take the entire hotel. They had to have 5 rooms of 55 left for transients to arrive. But this was a fun thing. Dick Rutter, a professor of dentistry, loved doing elaborate costumes. So here he is as TikTok of Oz. The 2 little boys don't understand that this is a costume and that it's an Oz book character. They think it's a robot, and they're a little bit afraid of it. But they finally were willing to walk around behind and wind the key that made the TikTok work. Then I give you a quick glimpse of family again. David Hall, Susan Hall's brother, was at this convention at Yosemite. Mm-hmm. And Glenn Ingersoll, still a teenager, and Eric Jovog, both of them long-standing members of the Oz Club, were still teenagers at that point. But Eric continues to be very active with the Winkies all these years later. And then around that same time, one of our visitors was Algene Harmetz, who was a stringer in Los Angeles covering the Hollywood beat for the New York Times, a really fine writer. And she was beginning to work on her first book, which was to be called The Making of the Wizard of Oz. I had been collecting Wizard of Oz MGM material to some extent, but not so much as John Fricke. So she networked with the 2 of us and learned from us, but then she did her own research, and she had come out of the Hollywood industry. So she actually had access to MGM in a way that I did not when I was in library school at UCLA. I did have access, but it was very limited. She discovered that if you wanted to look at progressive scripts, you didn't go to the archive of MGM, you went to the law office, because the scripts were never published and they were kept under lock and key. So she could actually document the development. But in 1979, the 40th anniversary of that movie, Algene and her husband hosted a major exhibition and program at a private club in Los Angeles called the Variety Arts Center. And I was invited because I was president of the Oz Club at that time. And at that meeting in 1979, probably in June, I met Margaret Hamilton for the first time. And because it was so crowded with fans, when it came time for our box lunches, Margaret Hamilton and her young bodyguard could not keep the autograph seekers away from her. So I stepped forward to help protect her from the crush. And I figured out that we could go through French doors onto a balcony over the street and shut the doors behind us. So the three of us had our box lunches outdoors at that particular occasion. Then later in the summer, I attended the Osmopolitan meeting at Castle Park, Michigan. And Laura Jane Muzzer, who's also in the picture, was very fond of hosting celebrity visitors. So she said, you know, Margaret Hamilton, you have to go to the airport with my chauffeur and meet her at the airport because you're the only one who has met her. So I would have this wonderful second meeting with Margaret in 1979, and I saw her again a few times in New York. But back at Yosemite, I show a variety of people. This is somebody who now lives in Oakland near me, and that is Katie Coley, K-O-E-L-L-E, the daughter of Barbara Coley, who lived into her 90s and who was president of the Oz Club at one point and editor of the Bomb Bugle. But as I said, the costume thing was still a big deal at Yosemite. So Virginia Fowler, who was a major competitor in costumes, is there as Princess Langwidere with several of her extra heads in a basket. And Katie Fleming is dressed as Ozga from TikTok of Oz. But one of the great things for us, and it created a link between the Midwestern conventions, the Osmopolitan, and the Pacific Coast, is that Brenda Baum eventually lived in California in her last years. And she was at this particular convention. Dick Rutter was in great competition for costumes, but he ended up taking a year off each year because it was getting to be unpleasant because both he and Virginia were trying to outdo each other. And it was really better if they didn't fight it out. So this is a year when he's not in costume. And there he is interviewing Brenda. One of our longtime members on the West Coast is Beverly Mendheim from Seattle. And she, in this instance, is dressed as Queen Zixi of Ix. Another person who began attending the West Coast meetings, we already knew him from the Midwest, was Mark Lewis, who was something of an impresario, very, very talented in dramatic production. And he attended the 1983 convention. So we're on the veranda outside of the Sun Parlor, looking out at the lawn of the Wawona Hotel. And he's chatting with Patrick Mond and Rick Thompson, the fellow in the blur on the right. And that was 1983. So the speakers of honor were Eloise Jarvis McGraw, who wrote the very last Oz book with her daughter, Lauren Lynn. And Eloise had never been to Yosemite before, and I love Yosemite. So I said, I would like to take you to the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. Would you like to go? Oh, I would love it, she said. So I took teenage David Maxine with us, and we wandered around, and there is one great big giant sequoia that is hollow. And Eloise went into the hollow to look around, and as she came out, dressed to the nines, as you see, she sewed all her own clothing. I captured a picture of her. But that was the last year at Wawona, because the party that night got raided by the night security people of the Wawona because we were very loud and noisy. And he came and the manager came and summoned me out and said, you've got to calm this down. There is a retired judge from Fresno who hates the idea that any group other than campers is staying here, and your party is very noisy. If you don't quiet it down, you will be taken to jail in Fresno. So I had to escort Eloise back to her room quietly, and she chuckled and said, I never been to a party where I got raided before. So I took us the next year over to the shore once again to Asilomar Conference Center. And this building, let me back up for a moment. It's on the shore at Asilomar State Beach. And then it has buildings that were designed by a major California architect, Julia Morgan, for the YWCA back in the teens, but it became a state park in the 50s. This is the chapel, the YWCA. The Young Women's Christian Association was somewhat church-oriented, so there was a chapel, but it was now being used as an auditorium. And we did a lot of our programming there. Some years later, we moved to newer quarters off the old grounds onto the newer grounds. And in the back nooks and crannies, there were ways of hiding or displaying things. And so here we see relics from a major flower exhibition of the Sonoma County Fair in Santa Rosa that took place the year before this. And there is a life-size mannequin of Dorothy in costume. There is a cowardly lion. The fur isn't fur, it is vegetable matter. It's probably wheat straw. And then the person who put that major flower show together is Jackie Giuffre. She spells her name Jacque, like the male name Jacques, and Giuffre is Italian, Giuffre. But she painted covers on full-size masonite sheets of the Oz book covers, and they decorated our hall. That is Jackie. In fact, I just heard from her and her husband yesterday by coincidence, so I sent her this picture last night. Susan Hall, I've mentioned before because I mentioned her brother David Hall up at Yosemite, but Susan also was a person who loved doing costumes and still does, and this is she at the Asilomar facility. And then Berkeley fixtures for a long time, both now deceased, are Jan and Don Fisher, who were neighbors of mine in Berkeley. We've seen pictures of little Stephen Kuntz, and this is his older brother David, who was never quite so keen on Oz as Stephen was. But this is what it was like. You have these shared gatherings in private dining rooms, children and adults learning to get to know each other. Brenda Baum, now Brenda Baum Turner, continued to come as long as she was able. And here she is at Asilomar, again dressed to the nines, with Katie Fleming in her poppy blouse. Virginia Fowler, whom I mentioned earlier, and Fred Otto, who was in a very early photograph back in 1968 in Santa Barbara, were very, very close friends. And he celebrated Oz books by writing rhymed jargon poetry, telling each story of Oz in rhyme. And this is our famed John Fricke, historian of the MGM Wizard of Oz, at that same convention, giving Brenda a hug. She had known him since he was 17.
Wow.
And this is the adopted son of Gary Shaw, who's the Oz Club's attorney. They attended this meeting, and they had also attended the Oz Flower Show in Santa Rosa. And it was fun. I mean, the costumes were often very serious. This is an extended effort to have Dorothy competition, and the father of a family of several kids decided he would be a male Dorothy. So he's in shorts and suspenders in his blouse and his basket with a Toto in it.
Something that Freddie Fogarty later on replicates as well.
And then one of the things that began to become more and more evident at the Asilomar meetings were dramatic plays, sometimes with music. In this particular one, it's an original play of The Yellow Knight of Oz, which is a Ruth Plumly Thompson Oz book. And it was a combination of live performers and singers and puppets. And you can see the puppeteer as a character in the background. You can see his hand. And this was a show that was produced for us by Chris Sterling, who is the fellow that Patty has her hand on the shoulder of. Then one point, because I was the registrar of these meetings, the phone rang and this high, pipey little voice called up, and it was somebody's introducing himself. Mr. Hanff, this is Matt Abreu, and I want to find out how my mom and I can attend the convention. And so I told him how to do it, and he and his mother arrived at Asilomar. So that's Matt at his very first convention. Other mainstays in the West Coast, more celebrities to us at least, were Jim Nitsch, Colonel Nitsch from the United States Army, retired, and he had never married because he had fallen in love with Dorothy Tuttle years before, but she married somebody named Latour. And he did nothing about marrying, he just kept his eye on her. And when she was finally free to marry again, they finally got together. And so they became kind of an Oz romance for all of us who knew them. But this is a day in a very nice restaurant that we often had dinner at the night before the Oz meeting started in Pacific Grove. The fellow in the center, right next to Jim Nitsch, is Mark Latour, who is the eldest child of Dorothy Nitsch. And this is Mark Latour's nephew, Sean, a son of Mark's younger brother. And Sean later styled himself Sean de Latour, not to be outdone by his uncle. And then at one of our meetings, we did our primary program as a public program, and we did it at a school auditorium in Pacific Grove and invited several of the little people from the MGM movie. Margaret Pellegrini is with the microphone in her hand and in the costume recreating her flower pot costume from the MGM movie. And Carl Slover is, I believe, the fellow, unless that's Swenson. I forgot which person that is. We can verify this later. And his wife. So John Fricke came out from New York to interview them. They'd all known John for years and years. And Margaret was actually a dues-paying member of the Oz Club. She loved coming to the meetings, and she would come even if she wasn't going to be part of the program. Then other celebrities for us are Gita Morena, who is the great-granddaughter of L. Frank Baum. She is Ozma Baum's daughter and her partner at Asilomar. And then I like showing the growing up of people we've known for a really long time. You can see that this is Ryan Ganaway. He told me that he could remember me, but I didn't quite remember him from his first meeting at the Asilomar grounds. He said, well, I was small and I had great big glasses. Oh, you're the boy who looked like a grasshopper. I said, he was insane. I was trying to tease him. I guess it worked. But there he is, second from the right, as a young adult. But this was a special occasion. It's probably the 50th anniversary of the Oz Club, which itself was founded in 1957. So this is probably 2007. And Justin Schiller, our flounder, as we often call him, is on the left. Then Dave Green and I, Barbara Coley, Michael Gessel, and Atticus Ganaway, and Sean Duffley. All of them at one point or another editors of the Baum Bugle. So it was kind of a reunion for both the club and for us. But although Ruth Plumley Thompson never attended a West Coast meeting, her granddaughter, her niece attended, and she's from the Philadelphia area. She's the woman with the black top and the pearls. And after Fred had died, his sister, Nancy, who's the last member of that generation, flew out, and Nancy Petrasco married a man from Poland and converted to Catholicism. And so I took her to the Carmel mission, which is an absolutely glorious reconstructed mission. It's one of the, I think it's the only mission that has continuously been a real Catholic church, but it's got magnificent gardens that are planted up in the arid kinds of plants that grow properly in the California. And then this is one more family gathering, the Hollisters, and it's during the time of the costume parade. So I just wanted to show you that we deal with generations in this club. This is a person that at the time was known as Liz Chumley, the ballerina par excellence, absolutely exquisitely beautiful as the swan, probably from Glinda of Oz, the very book that Colin showed us at the beginning. And this is Amanda Spencer, because this is how Liz Chumley grew up. That represents a few minutes of visiting old friends. Thanks for listening. So you've had a sense of what we were doing at the conventions called the Winkie Convention in those days. And something that I didn't put a lot of emphasis on was one of the major features, which was the Saturday auction of collectibles, primarily books and art, but something that was always a very important part of the program. We then realized, or I did because I was the registrar, that we were going to have visitors coming over from Stoke-on-Trent in England. And this was engineered quite a bit because I had to do the registration, but they had also been corresponding with David Maxine and Eric Schanauer. So Colin Ayres and Neil Ardley flew over. I think it was their first trip to the States and to California, and spent a few days with David and Eric. Then they decided to rent a Mustang convertible and drive up to Asilomar. So I knew they were coming, and I knew which room I had assigned them to. That was fine. But on Thursday night, the night before it started, we were, the early gang was already over at a pizza restaurant that we always had a Thursday night dinner at. And the phone rang, because by this time we had cell phones, we didn't in earlier years. And it was Colin calling David for instructions. And David started giving the most elaborate driving instructions to visitors from England who weren't even used to driving on the right side of the road in a pitch dark town, which has almost no streetlights. And this went on and on. I finally said, David, I can go over and pick them up and bring them over to the restaurant faster than your instructions, and they won't get lost. So I went over to Asilomar and picked up the two guys and met them. And Neil said to me, Colin collects a lot of books. And I heard him say that. And I turned to Colin and I said, do you also say books? And he said, I do. And that was the beginning of my encounter with, and I don't even know, is it a Liverpudlian accent? I don't know what you would call that accent, but it's an accent that I hadn't encountered before.
So, yeah, the Stoke-on-Trent accents, I think in America, you tend to have either exposure to Cockney accents or extremely posh, you guys would say fancy, received pronunciation, you know, like the Queen, whereas our accents, you don't tend to hear so much on television, and we're probably closer to Liverpool than we are to London, certainly. And you will at times find that my accent changes from book to books because I would have been brought up to say book. However, I've lived with a person from Stoke-on-Trent now for a number of years. I've picked up a little bit of that accent. And I do find at OzCon, even some very good friends struggle with my accent at times because I do speak quite fast and I have to slow down. And then I've even my friends who've come over with me now to Florida or to California have said, oh, you slip into an American accent ever so slightly as soon as you come over. I said, and that's from several years of coming over and trying to order food and not being able to get what I want or need. And just remembering to slow down. But I suppose, yeah, so I came to OzCon in 2012, and I'll move over to some slides that I've got. And I think really just to pick up where Peter started off with the wonderful Wizard of Oz, I've got a first edition Glinda of Oz, which I never thought I would get in my possession, and I got it at a very reasonable price at OzCon. And the whole point of this presentation was to really show the 56-year spread of the Oz Convention that started as Winkie Con, that Peter was the original chair of, and I'm the current chair now. And for those that have been regularly, would probably like the reminiscence of the different people. And those who are new through the virtual con to get a feel for what the convention's like and the length of history behind it, because it's the longest running convention, I believe.
It is that.
Yeah. And I certainly would never have believed that I would be chairing the convention as I have done since 2018 until next year. And then after next year, I'll retire from doing it. But I just came over for a holiday. Okay, so this is actually before my first OzCon in 2010. I think it was September. And it was in Bristol, England. And I'd been speaking with David Maxine online, and he happened to mention that he and Eric would be in Bristol because Eric Shanower, who is quite well known, as was David in the Oz circles, Eric Shanower I would consider to be our current Dick Martin. He's illustrated many of the Oz books and had some of his work from the Age of Bronze on show in Bristol. David happened to mention that they were in Bristol, and if I would like to come down and see them, I'd be more than welcome. So as soon as I found this out, I moved the earth to be able to go and visit Bristol. In fact, had to drive from Worcester to Liverpool and then down to Bristol to make it work. Don't even ask how, because it's basically driving 2 hours one way and then 3 hours back the other way. But I was going to meet them. And it was also 4 weeks before I married my husband, Neil. So I was planning other things in the background, and we had a really good time. It was my first ever exposure to really speaking to somebody in person about Oz and the Oz collections. And that conversation led me to come to America for the first time in 2012. And so first trip to the USA, first trip to an Oz convention, and first trip to Disneyland. And I say that because all these things are very intertwined in terms of my relationship now with the US. So these are from my first Winkie Con, which was 2012 at the Asilomar. So picking off from where you left off, really, Peter. And for me, that first Oz convention, I would say I probably had one of those life-changing moments very similar to when I first started collecting Oz, because I discovered this world of not just Oz, but of friendship and very lasting friendships. That there's many people from the convention now that if we lived in the same country and in the same state, we would be hanging around regularly. You and I have socialized outside of OzCon in England and in California. And this was the thing for me, and this is why it was what I loved about it the most was not just the friendships and the love of it, but the social side of things, which is why you've got many photos here of it. I think the impact was just sitting together and understanding each other and different people's loves of OzCon, or Neil being dragged there, not really being a Oz fan, still enjoyed the company. Regulars of the convention now, Judy Bieber, John Bell, who helps me with the daytime programming at the convention, as well as a friend, Caroline Spector. And these people welcomed us in open arms. You never had to think about where to sit because people were encouraging you over it. And it was this family atmosphere that I think appeals to other people, that was very appealing to me from the word go. And this was meant to have been a one-off trip. I was never really meant to come back to certainly OzCon again. However, that changed quite significantly because I then came home and had to be back in 2013 at the last time at the SLMR, because the camaraderie was so important and the Oz geekiness of it all, of the books and the auctions, particularly as a British Oz fan, where we don't have a great deal of access to the Oz books, and there's certainly no Oz conventions in the UK. I have met with a couple of guys down in London that led to another Oz fan, which I'll speak about later, coming over with me, but it doesn't exist. So it was a lovely new world in American campground feel of a Selamar that was just wonderful and just a little bit daft and zany. So we've got some more Oz regulars here. So I know that's Carol Carlson that I'm hugging there. Sam Malazzo, who's Australian, who's been coming to the convention, I think, since 2011.
Let me interrupt. Let me interrupt at that point. Sam is indeed from Australia, and I knew he was coming. And I wrote him several letters. By this time, we're writing by email. And I said, it's very cold at Asilomar. Please remember to bring layers of clothing. So he brought t-shirts and shorts and nearly froze to death because it's in the Pacific Ocean. It's way out, it's a peninsula, and it gets the summer fog bank almost every summer, and it gets down into quite chilly temperatures. You can attest to that because of your experience. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I worried about, and there was nothing I could do about it, but the first time that you and Neil arrived, the opening reception had to be a root beer float party, which is something that Americans are used to. But I have in my collection of photographs and a remarkably revealing image of you and Neil attempting not to grimace too much as this extravagantly sweet concoction with bubbles hits your mouth. But that was something that was happening at a salon we had no control over. We had to spend a certain amount of money beyond the actual expense of running a meeting. And one of the ways we could spend that money was to bring in a local company that made root beer floats. So that's what we did.
Yes, and I think my learning from that was that we loved America. We loved OzCon and the friendships. We loved Disney. We loved pancakes. However, we certainly did not love the root beer. It was a strange concoction of sweet and sour, and I'm sorry to say that I will never had it again after that point. But and also I came with a love of margaritas as well. So, you know, what 1 out of 5 or 6, I don't think I'm doing too bad, really. And I think you mentioned about registration was one of the first things that I did at the OzConnection, that you were instrumental. And I think that gave me access to speaking to people that I wouldn't normally speak to. And I think anyone who's never been it doesn't matter if you don't know anybody at the OzConvention, everyone will speak to you, and you have an instant connection through Oz before anything else, even though there are much more elaborate conversations that go on around Oz. Oz kind of is the link that brings us all together in its many different guises. So this is Freddie Fogarty and Amanda Spencer, which you'd mentioned earlier. And this is Freddie dressed as Dorothy. So the costume contests were always a big thing for me very early on, and I got involved. Freddie looking as Man Dorothy, which I do wonder now whether that was a recreation of the picture from the earlier Man Dorothy. And then the fabulous Amanda Spencer, another one of my good friends, dressed as Glinda from Oz the Great and Powerful. This picture is probably campy as hell. I am very thin at this point, so one of my thin periods of time, but I think it just amplifies just how fun and daft and just have a silly old time at the conventions. So you've got Freddie Fogarty, David Maxine with his partner, Eric Chenoweth in the background, Michael Riley on the left, one of your good friends as well. He hasn't been in OzCon for a few years. And then Tim Tucker in the background. This was from the first convention I went to, which was when Sky Island was the theme. This was the lovely Susan Morse, who was the singing voice for Dorothy in the 1960, was it, Peter Return to Oz animated cartoon. Susan, we sadly lost last year, I believe. But it was just very early on. There was, you know, in all circles at least, known people of some kind. She was such a lovely, friendly person, and you can generally go up and talk to any of the Oz celebrities.
We make fun of people with 9-inch heels. She was wearing 9-inch heels on that image you just showed us, and I realized instantly that she could barely walk in them. So I became her escort, and she just held onto my arm to keep from falling on her fanny. So that's the way that went.
Yeah, and I don't know if these pictures are in the right order, actually. I'm just going to go back a second. No, it's okay. I thought I had one of... I've jumped far too ahead. I thought I had one of Karen Marshall. I don't believe I had it, but Karen Marshall was also at the second convention I went to, the first convention.
Yes.
She was the stand-in for Judy Garland.
Right, and she was in her 90s, yeah.
Yeah, she'd been driven over by David Maxine all the way from, I can't recall, is it Palm Springs?
It was Palm Springs. He drove over and got her and drove her all the way up to Asilomar.
And Neil and I, in our top-down Mustang, which was a whole other story in itself to how we got that. Ended up driving Karen Marshall around the Asilomena site in a top-down Mustang, which was, yeah, that was just kind of cool. Then after 2013, the OzConvention moved to the Town and Country in San Diego. So I did get to see the end of Asilomar, and I believe the reason we moved had a large part to do with the costs getting very expensive to stay at the Asilomar, and they were expanding to bigger conventions, but also to be for David Maxine, the chair at the time, to be able to expand the convention to a much bigger level. And I think this is the convention that we had around 300 people. And again, it just for me added to the love of going around California. I think you'd mentioned to me previously that, and certainly in your older slides, you talk about Oz being very bookish and surrounding the books. And this particular convention was celebrating the 30th anniversary of Return to Oz that Freddie Fogarty chaired. And we had quite a number of the people involved in the making of the film, such as Emma Ridley. Justin Case came over from Australia. He was the Scarecrow. We had Paul Molansky, one of the producers. So it was a very filmic convention in terms of its viewing. I loved every minute of it. And again, sadly, actually, in this picture, sat there with John and Atticus and Miriam Goldman, who also sadly left us a few years ago, who was a lovely person. So you get to meet some people, and sometimes, sadly, quite a few people go away. Emma Ridley over there, and then we've got Madeleine Knutson, who's also another good friend, and another generational thing from the conventions, because her mom is the big Oz fan, Robin Knutson, who I used to thought was Knutson, because in the UK, the way it's spelt, Knutson, we would say Knutsford because we have a town called Knutsford up the road, but I learned quite quickly it's Knutson, just for that slight difference in our use of language. The biggest thing for me about going to the San Diego OzCon was the first Return to Oz one, I believe, Peter, if my memory is right. In fact, no, maybe the year afterwards, was going to on the Sunday morning for Sunday brunch at the Coronado del Hotel, or Del Coronado
Hotel del Coronado, it's called,
which is a small island off of San Diego that takes about a 2-mile bridge to get to this little island. And this is where Al Frank Baum used to holiday regularly and write some of the Oz books, and also lived on the island briefly at one time. And this Sunday brunch was absolutely amazing. It was $100 a head, and it was worth every penny. I've never had anything quite like it, but also to be in a beautiful building, Victorian building that was also used in a Marilyn Monroe film. Was it the one, Some Like It Hot?
Yeah.
Also, if you've been to Walt Disney World, that kind of feel of that hotel is very similar to the Grand Floridian, because they go for the very Victorian era hotels, and the Grand Floridian was also based loosely on this particular hotel. And perhaps another thing to point out with OzCon would be the after parties, which had a great impact on this particular brunch, because Neil, my husband, had got extremely drunk at the after party with Freddie Fogarty and could not make brunch at all. So I brought somebody else in his place. So you do have to watch out for those low-flying cocktails at 3 in the morning, but that's also a very big part of the socializing.
We sometimes refer to the cocktails as waters of oblivion.
Mm-hmm. And they often have very Aussie names. I think Maxine's made a woozy before now. I can't remember some of them off the top of my head, but there's cocktails and drinking, particularly on a Saturday night, things that, don't get wild from a raucousness point of view. And there's a lot of camaraderie off the back of that. But then generally on a Sunday, most of us are very hungover, and the programming on a Sunday morning is usually a little bit later to allow us all to come alive after only having 3 hours sleep. 16, the convention then moved from the town and country to Portland, Oregon, with Carol Carlson and Eric Jovarg ran the convention. Now, I wasn't at the 2016 convention. I took that year off from going to the convention, and I came 2017, and I brought with me, I say brought with me, I encouraged the lovely Brian, who's there dressed as Button Bright from Scotland. We met in London. I'd been speaking to a couple of British Oz fans online, and 4 of us met in London for the day and went to see the Wiz at the BFI Theatre, I believe. And Brian enjoyed himself so much, I encouraged him to come over, and he forged very good relationships with not just myself, but with Carol Carlson, particularly, and David and Eric, and Brian has been to at least 2 more conventions since then, so we've got him hooked as well. So slowly but surely we're bringing the UK back to the United States. I don't think we'll ever be in control of it, so there'll be no redcoat wars. For me, I enjoyed the camaraderie at was it the Sheraton Hotel in Portland, Peter? I think it was called the Sheraton.
The airport Sheraton in Portland.
The programming was fun. I wasn't necessarily a big fan of the Sheraton itself. After seeing the Asilomar and being at the town and country, what made it was the people and the programming. But the hotel itself for me was a little bit drab. It was
I
great.
did mean to tease you a little bit about the Asilomar, because the second year you came to Asilomar, you came by yourself, and you were coming to Berkeley to stay with me for a weekend, and we were going to go over to the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, which is not run by the Disney Corporation, but by members of his family. But in the middle of the night, you came and knocked on my door and said, "I've discovered something terrifying. I left my passport and my airplane ticket under the mattress of my bed at Asilomar. What can we do?" So
and I believe as well that I've been sharing a room with Gary as well.
Yeah, and so I realized that the plan for the next day was not going to be the Disney Museum, but a return to Asilomar. And I began making phone calls to Asilomar because I wanted them to find the passport and airplane ticket before somebody else did. And so I began calling at 9, and I think I finally reached a live person at Asilomar by 10, and they found it. So we rushed down to pick that up. But it turned out to be a beautiful day. We did go visit the Carmel Mission. We did have a beautiful French dinner at Fandango, which is a French restaurant in Pacific Grove. So we just didn't go to Disney that day. Next time.
Yeah, and we did go to the Walt Disney Museum, I think, the day after, so I still got to do what I wanted to do. But in my defense as well, so any other Oz fan would understand my defense, which was that for some reason at the Asilomar, it was a lovely surroundings, but the customer service on the reception desks possibly left a lot to be desired at times, and the safe in our room wasn't working, and I was always paranoid about losing my passport, particularly coming from another country. So I hid it in the middle of the mattress, and I was more concerned or forgot about where I'd put it. I was very bothered about packing my first edition Oz books that I bought at the auction. I was more bothered about packing them correctly than even thinking about my passport. So that's where that story come from. Back to the Portland OzCon. This is Inyana McGraw, who is Lauren McGraw, but goes by another name now. So you saw a picture of her mother earlier back in Yosemite, and it was great to meet her because she was a co-writer of the Merry-Go-Round of Oz. And I also did a presentation on the Britishness and the Britishisms of the Merry-Go-Round of Oz book, which Inyana was very much responsible for at the time in the 60s. And if you ever do read that book, have a think about the context against bomb. there's a very underlying British tone throughout that book at times. Also, 2017 convention, Eric Oliveira, who's dressed there with Ozma poppies on her head, became a regular and is now co-chair with me this year and next year for the OzCon, and then will be taking over as chair from 2021. So that's where you, again, we keep adding people along the way. And I usually collect at least one person or two people each Oz convention, and I add them to my ornament collection of friends, as it were. One of the loveliest things about Portland, though, was the boat ride. It's like was it a pedal boat, Peter? I can never think of how you describe these.
It's a steam-driven paddle wheel boat that goes above the dam on the Columbia River. It's the Bonneville Dam, it's called. And above that point, there is a very wide river. And both years that I've been on that river, it was extremely breezy, but also very, very sunny and beautiful. So it's a very pleasant outing, and it's an extra thing that people could opt to do, but quite a few of us did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I believe you took this picture, actually, if memory serves. And
I think that's true.
And there's a Neil Tombecker there to the right of me, and Neil is another good friend, helped chair last year's Oz convention with me. There's Bill Thompson to the right of a Neil, the red shirt. He's the auctioneer for the the International Wizard of Oz Club, and runs the auctions each year. Is that Susan Hall to the left? I might not be, actually, but I know she was on that boat because her and David, you'd mentioned them earlier, were both on that boat trip. It was a nice way to end a convention, and I think that's the thing, there's usually little excursions after the back of the conventions.
But this was, I believe, that convention was the one that Brian Russell attended for the first time, as you mentioned earlier. And I barely got to know him. As you said, he's very shy. So I offered to drive a group up to the boat landing, which is a good 40 miles, I think, from where we were staying. And I told him I would have him sit next to me and he could be my navigator. And he said, "But I don't drive." And I said, "It doesn't matter whether you can drive, so long as you can read signs." "That I can do," he said. The fact was he really couldn't, because the signs on highways in the States are in a very different style of presentation. So I said, "Don't worry about it. If we get there safely, I will declare that you were an excellent navigator." And of course we got there safely.
So this is now 2018. The convention moved to the Kellogg West Conference Center and Hotel, and it is the link to the actual Kellogg cereal businessman. And this is in Pomona, California, which is about an hour's drive from the airport, the main airport, the LAX. And after 2 years of running the convention, so Carol and Eric had agreed to run the convention for 2 years, and in the background, a new convention center was sourced because the Sheraton was in Portland, Oregon. So the Oz convention left California for the first time, and then steps were taken to bring it back to South California. And this site was recommended by Algene Hormitz, that Peter had mentioned earlier as the writer of The Making of the Wizard of Oz. And Jay Davis was chair, and I was organizing chair for this particular convention. And it's a lovely site. It has much more of the outdoors and indoor feel of some of the earlier conventions, but also I think it feels a little bit like the town and country in terms of heat, and also a little bit like a Cellamore. So you've got a little bit of mixture of two. There are times when the air conditioning can be challenging. One of the biggest things that me and Jay brought back to the convention was the communal eating. So at its time in San Diego, the communal eating wasn't really possible apart from the awards ceremony that we very often do. And the way the way the town and country in San Diego was set up it wasn't really possible to do that. And I missed that a great deal, and many other people did, because that's how we socialized. And again, you've got a lot of your regular Oz convention goers here that you've seen earlier. So there's Robin Knutson in the white shirt at the table. And there's also Dave Keller as well, another regular OzCon goer and also very active in the Oz Club and helps design things. Also, the last couple of years, we've had some, it's very difficult nowadays to get some of the relatives from the Wizard of Oz because it's such an old film. But with the last couple of years, we did have Kiki Ebsen came, who was the daughter of Buddy Ebsen. We had Christiana Rickard, the niece of Ray Bolger. We've also had Joe Loft, who is Judy Garland's son. He was at the 2015 convention. So we do still keep linked with those films, even if it's through family. And that's always, for me, coming to the conventions from England, there's a definite family generational thing, as well as a love for Oz, that some people, I would say, perhaps aren't necessarily even massive Oz fans, but come because of the family connection of coming every year and meeting with their friends and the holiday vacation feel that happens over that weekend. One of the biggest things I was pleased about in Kellogg West is that the costume contest really came back to life again. And I'm not, I'm never really concerned about wearing a dress and being a Glinda with slightly off-skew boobs, shall we say, that was helped by a member of the Knut's family, did actually put those together for me. So I thanked Margaret for that. And that's been a lot of fun, seeing that come to life in the big hall that we use there, adding more and more people to the convention in the California area. So I think for the people we have here, so there is, on the right is Ruth Kudra and Neil Kudra. They've been to previous conventions. If I remember right, under the gnomes, I think, are some of the Hollisters. The one in the centre is not one of the Hollisters. That is Osroy, who's a new regular to the convention. And I can't really remember the fellow's name on the left, but he and his daughter, it was a Magic of Oz theme, and they were the Lymaneags from that particular book. And he did have both of them had a big gold knob on their tails, so they went for the full detail. And we had Algene Harmit back this last year, interviewing the Wicked Witch of the West, played by Kurt Raymond, who's been the Wicked Witch of the West impersonator for the last 20 odd years, and also did a fabulous turn of the witch at the 80th anniversary screening of The Wizard of Oz in Pomona, which was a joy to put on, and to be able to see that film with Oz fans for a second time on the big screen, but for the 80th was wonderful. I suppose for reminiscing, and we could talk for hours, Peter, I suppose what I'd be keen really now on is how you feel 56 years later. The Oz convention is still going and still moving around California. Unfortunately, this year, due to COVID-19, we've not been able to have the convention over the July 18th weekend. So we're going with virtual Oz convention, and we're also launching the OzConnection YouTube channel, which will have several of these videos on there so that we can share things from the convention, but also add on extra Oz filmings and features that we wouldn't necessarily always get to touch regularly at the convention itself. How do you feel, Peter? So 1964 was the first ever Winkie Con. I think it was referred to as OzCon for the first time 5 years after that, but it was still Winkie Con. It was just Winkie Con, Winkies and OzCon. How do you feel 56 years later, knowing that the convention's still alive and well in many different guises, is virtual this year for the first time to make sure that we're still present and still have the 56th year, is run by a British guy currently. How's it feel?
It feels really very good. When we were evolving the convention through time, which seems in most respects not so very long ago, especially when I'm working on pictures from the past, the memories are very strong in all these years, and the connections and friendships have been very strong as well. One thing I did worry about, and this was something that particularly worried David and Eric, is that there was a period of time, probably in the 1990s, when attendance began falling off quite a bit. at Asilomar. And I think that the 50th anniversary book gives a couple of explanations for why that might have been. Part of it was that the original crowd was very old or was no longer able to travel and wasn't around anymore. And the need to attend a meeting in order to buy a book was much less urgent. So those are two real things that happened. I was more comfortable with assuming that we might evolve into a point where we were no longer active, but that didn't work well for Eric and David. They really were almost despondent about it. And I said, then why don't you fix it? And they took that as a challenge, and to their credit, they began changing the nature and focus of the program so that it ended up being far more focused, I think, on theatrical and dance, which works very well for a large crowd. And as you said, when we did the first one in San Diego, we had about 300 people, or maybe even more than that. It was possible to pull the thing back together, but it's not quite the same group as it was before. But the friendships that you've identified as a theme throughout continue to be possible. And one of my goals all the way through, and you mentioned this by saying that I put you beside me at the registration table, was because I was the registrar for so long, I always knew who was new and had not been there before. I often would put a symbol on a name badge so that people who had been around for a while would at least go up and greet somebody new. But by having somebody brand new sit with me, I could introduce and get them talking to newcomers. And that was my particular way of being ecumenical, I guess you could say. But I really think it's important because when you are returning for a family reunion or a friends reunion or a club reunion year after year, you're seeing people for the first time in a year. So it's not unnatural to sort of focus on people that you already know, but that does leave the newcomers somewhat to the side. So that was something that I think you've succeeded at Pomona in helping with, and I was always striving to do the same thing. So I think the convention continues to have vitality. Its focus is a little bit different, and it will always differ because whoever is doing program or coordination will have a slightly different perspective from the people who were there before. So to me, that's a sign of good health for the organization.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to say thank you for starting the convention, because obviously if it wasn't around, I would never have came in the first place. And I'm just fascinated by how these roots of these things start. This started in the living room of your mother's home, and now it's a regular thing that's at a conference center. So a big appreciation for that. And for me, running it now, my aims have always been that my convention, I know from what Eric and David set up, because that's when I came along, and was keeping that going. I'm not necessarily an artistic person, but I am a manager in my day job. So be able to pull and organize people together is something that I'm strong at. Don't get me wrong, it is, anyone who wants to do it later on, please do it. But it's difficult to do at times because you've got to run a part-time job in the background, essentially, as a volunteer to make it happen. It's the love of Oz and the love of the people at the convention that keep me going, because you want to give that little bit back. And this is my kind of way of making my mark on the Oz community, because I'm unlikely to write a book, but at least I've been able to give 4 years of my life to the convention and the friendships that foster from that. And that even as the chair now, there's some of the friendships I'm making as a chair, because it puts you in contact with different people as well, and obviously you get more well known. It's nice to carry on making more and more friendships off the back of it. It's a wonderful experience from that point of view.
Yeah. Well, I hope that our conversation has encouraged people who are going to be watching this a few days from now to realize that it's a meeting and a group well worth getting to know. And I hope that we'll be able to meet some of you in the coming year.
Definitely. And as of this date, which is the 12th of July that Peter and I are recording this, there was over 120 registrants, and at least 50% of them, because running this for a few years, you get to know the names that pop up on the list. I know 50% of you have never been to the convention before. So whilst we can't replicate the full convention on video, we're giving you examples from many presentations and live Zoom calls, just give you a taster really of what the convention can be like. And I certainly, fingers crossed with COVID-19 next year, we'll be back at our home in Kellogg West. And come along, because I think for a lot of you, particularly Oz fans, particularly broad Oz fans, you'll get a lot of joy out of what the convention does and how we all come together. And to increase your Oz collection in a way that is probably much more inexpensive than eBay at times, and you can get some very rare items. So thank you for joining me, Peter. It's been great reminiscing on our own little Yellow Brick Road journeys from California, Stoke-on-Trent to Oz. I appreciate it.
Well, you've certainly helped make this a remarkable program, and the convention is truly an OzCon International. Thank you for coordinating this.
Thank you.